Hello, I'm Colin Scott Thompson. Welcome to my workshop. This is the third part of a series of videos discussing lines, the part at least between just above the connector link to where it reaches the canopy. For other information on connector links and parts like that, toggles and things, you could watch some of the other videos that are already up. But in this video, I'd like to discuss the stabilizer slider stop, these rings that stop the slider grommet going any further up the lines during the initial part of the deployment. I'd also like to cover stitch styles. When we stitch a cascade in, or the link end or the other end, what sort of stitch is best? A zigzag, a Bartack, a straight stitch, hand stitch, no stitch? These things do make a difference. Some not quite so drastic as others. Thread tension tends to be a bit of an issue. These lines can be tricky to stitch sometimes, and if you've had a new line set put on, or it's come from the factory in some cases, the thread tensions won't be spot on. You need to have them snug down quite nicely so that they sink down as close to the line as possible. If the thread is set up on the machine with quite a loose tension, you'll find on one side or the other, or on both sides, the thread sits quite proud. And as we discussed in the second part of this video series, if the slider, particularly a brass slider, on your grommet gets a little bit damaged or has some nicks in it as it's coming down the lines, it's going to be scratching down these lines. And if the thread is sitting proud, you could end up having that thread be taken off. There were some curious moments years ago with a certain manufacturer where I'd have a customer come in and say, "Hey, can you repair my line? It just broke." I said, "Wow, that's strange. The lines look new. What happened? A hard opening?" No, it was a normal opening. It just, when I landed, I was packing and realized I had a line extra. I looked, the line hadn't broken. It had purely slipped out of the cascade point. It had been stitched originally. But what had happened with the slider coming down, it had scraped the threads away. And curiously, when you looked at the other lines, what you're seeing here is a simulation of it, because I don't have photographs from back in the old days. But on one side of the line, you would see a perfectly formed stitch. And if you turned it 180 degrees, there were just little gray dots where the threads were just barely visible. So if you pulled the thread on the other side, it would unravel. It was an issue with the tension of the thread, plus a slider grommet that was maybe not as smooth as it ought to be. So let's go through some of these things. The stabilizer slider stop as well, how it's attached to the stabilizer itself. The line is attached there. In this particular case, there's a piece of type 12 tape zigzagged around. It's really a substantial section. It's also reinforced with a nice little spreader foundation that it can sit on to not have such a brutal change in energy. Some manufacturers choose just to have the type 12 thrown straight on. Others don't use type 12. They'll use a lighter weight pocket for the penny washer basically that's in here. And if you've got a nice zigzag stitch and a heavier tape, when the slide is pushing on here every opening, it's going to take a long time before you see some damage being created. On other canopies, when you see the lighter weight construction, there's a good chance, like there's several out there that don't have a zigzag around, they just have a straight stitch. And that stitching can eventually fail, and the ring will then move into the top part of the pocket, which of course results in fabric being pulled through the slider grommet, which is defeating the whole object of this. Other manufacturers are using nice rings, but they allow them to rattle around inside there. So I would tend to want to squeeze the ring down as close to the edge of the stabilizer and add some stitching around the top end here to stop the ring from moving away. The majority of these rings inside are a metal, an aluminium disc or a steel disc. Sometimes you'll find some with a plastic ring cut in there. It's okay in some cases, but again, if it was left packed and there was force on it, I have a little bit of an issue with having a plastic disc inside here instead of a metal one, because you'll find it distorting and potentially pulling through the slider grommet. You wouldn't want that. Parachute de France are using a real pucker high quality ring like you'd have on a 3-ring system. They did forget to put them in some of the Techno reserves. There was a bulletin out on that, so make sure your reserves, if you're packing a Techno, make sure it's got those top rings. There tends to be one on the A-line bottom skin on the tip, and then further back on the stabilizer. The location, this is beautiful. When you're packing, the fold can be made nice and neat. It's a bit of a pain when you have the line attached right in the middle of the ring. I'm a bit pedantic, so when I'm making a fold while packing, it's a little bit more tricky to make it look nice and pretty. But they work, so I don't know what I'm complaining about. I must have told you a million times, I don't exaggerate. Call me pedantic. Let's see. We've had some, I haven't seen it myself in direct, but somebody showed me some images, and this is a simulation of it, just so you get an idea. This stitch here, beautiful. They're really running a substantial stitch over the line, holding it onto the stabilizer. It ain't going nowhere, okay? At the canopies, you'll find a little stitch in the middle. It doesn't load up the line nicely over the whole piece, so you tend to focus the energies in a particular place, and it's not my favorite. I prefer to see the entire line covered over. This one here is a reenactment. It's a simulation of what happened somewhere else, but somebody had lovingly done a nice wide zigzag. All they'd made was a tunnel, so when you pulled the line, it would slip through as far as you'd like, as far as it could go. My preferred technique when I'm stitching is stitch down so it's hitting the middle of the line, and the other stitch is slightly outboard, come back the other way, then back through the middle, so I know it's really stitched on there well. So the Bartack. The Bartack is a beautiful machine. If you're wearing blue jeans, you've got Bartacks all over it. It's this machine that does a rapid stitch. It tends to do a straight stitch, then zigzag, zigzag, and it's back to the beginning. So it starts at one end, it finishes at the same end. It unravels. On a suspension line, it's really not an issue, but on a line attachment tape, machines that start at one end and finish at the same end, they have a tendency to start unraveling. So Performance Designs years ago saw that, and with the mechanical machines, they had the big disc cam modified so it would start in the middle and finish in the middle. The loading up of the tape, if it was a little bit more on one side than the other side, it had no issues with unraveling the stitch. But you will see on some canopies out there, have a little look, they might start unraveling if you've got one that was stitched with a machine that starts and finishes at an end, not in the middle. On your suspension line, I'd really argue there's no need for that. But today's wonderful modern Bartack machines, you just press a few buttons and it will do any pattern you like. Marvelous. I'm still running one that you need to put coal in the back and make sure the water levels are up to maintain the steam pressure. This area here, your control line and the cascade upper, what I call the upper control lines. On early models, you'll see this on early PD reserves. They took that cluster of 4 lines and they would finger trap them through the, what I call the central control line, and put one stitch through there. Okay, it worked great, but they did change the design and ended up having 2 and 2 lines stitched together individually. I'm guessing on extremely high loads, during a deployment, the tail is not loaded up perfectly symmetrically, and that stitch with all 4 lines being held together at the same time would be heavily loaded and potentially fail. It wouldn't mean that the lines would fall off. All they do is slip through a little bit on the loop of your central control line. But that's a curious one. If you're packing a early model PD reserve, you'll see them all stitched together. Or a main, you'll notice the mains were all stitched together as well. And then afterwards they moved to something that could handle even more load. Hopefully you're able to take it to that heavy load that it needs to be tested. So with some lines, they're so thin, running a zigzag just gets a little bit heavy trying to stitch those tiny lines. So running a straight stitch is perfectly acceptable. You'll notice some of the canopies here, they're having a long zigzag stitch, quite a narrow throw zigzag stitch. Works great. The ends are left open, so eventually they would start unraveling, but because the length was so long, it wouldn't really be an issue. You could just snip off the tail end. Others will run a line of maybe 6 or 8 stitches in a straight line back and forward. They work just fine. Okay, the Bartack is not the only way you can attach a line. You can stitch it by hand. I would prefer to be a little neater than this particular chap was doing. Spend a bit more time doing it. There are ways of attaching a line without any stitching required at all. I'm not sure I'd do it at a cascade point, but it could be achieved at an attachment point. And look on video part 1 of lines, and you'll see me doing that on the Sabre 2 with one of the modifications we have on that. So line trim, if you're having a line set change, for those of you who are changing your own lines, I'd really recommend measure up all your lines before removing them. And then, of course, when you put the new line set on, load them up and measure again and have a comparison to see the difference. Some manufacturers will number the canopy one way, others will number it the other way. There's no industry standard. And some manufacturers will manufacture canopies for other companies. So they'll use their own ideas on how to number the line set. So when you get a new line set and you were believing that that was number 1 line and that's number 2 line, that's number 3, number 4, number 5, and the person who made the line set has numbered it the other way, I'd rather you found that out while doing your post-work inspection, and with a comparison of your numbers before and after, you say, whoa, okay, something's a bit funky going on here. Let's relook this, because basically the only line that you will have correct is the one on number 3. Ask me how I know. When I was a young man, back being a kid with a crazy dream. Now, of course, when you do the before and after a line set comparison, before you start the work and after you finish the work with the new line set on there, if it's with Dynamer line, Spectra line, Microline, you'll see quite a radical change. You'll also notice it with the HMAs and the Vectrans. Not quite as radical. Then maybe some of you are worried about which color line should I get. If you see the Vectrans, they're coming in different colors. It's more a marketing ploy. I had a customer in my workshop quite some time ago, and he asked me, hey, what's that line on that canopy? It was when Vectran was just coming out. And I said, that's Vectran. And he said, that's not possible. Vectran's not that color. He came from the sailing world, racing sailing yachts, and they'd been using Vectran for quite some time. And because Vectran is a little bit delicate with exposure to UV, they used to cover the Vectran with a UV protection, and you could put in at the same time whatever pigment you wanted. And of course, they had it, if it's the New Zealand sailing world, of course, the All Blacks, they prefer to have a black line. Others would have blue or red to identify which line is which. And in the parachuting world, they've jumped on that. So of course you've got the oranges and the blacks and the blues. It's just a coating on the outside. It really doesn't make too much difference to us for skydiving purposes. And so on the subject of stabilizers, what are they good for? Well, some people think they don't have any use at all. If you look at glide path, now Flight Concepts, the canopies have the lovely flares to attach the lines to, super strong. And they then put the slider stops on the flares. There's no actual stabilizer on a lot of the canopies, reserves included. I remember a canopy back in the 90s called the Evolution. It was a high aspect ratio wing. They had no stabilizers. Some of the high performance canopies from New Zealand took the stabilizers off as well. But if you have them on your canopy, as most of you will, it would always be a good idea to have them connected to the lines between the left and right hand side symmetrically. It's not unusual for me to find the stabilizers attached off the mark, as it were. So to help with this explanation, I've taken the canopy out of my museum, the Nova from the Glide Path company, now known as Flight Concepts. The Nova was a good name. In Spanish it means it doesn't go. And the Nova as well was this bright light that you'd see out in space, which you thought was a new star arriving, and actually it wasn't. This canopy got a really bad reputation, and it's probably one of the causes is because the reference points for line trim were not that good. If you're going to make a reference point, always choose the same one. My personal choice is the stitch that attaches the tape to the bottom surface of the wing. If you look at the PDs, it's that little grey stitch or the blue stitch, but that will always be my reference. So when I'm doing a line check before putting a new line set on, I'll take a reference of the central A line, whether it's A1 or A5. Okay, that's the center cell. We work our way down and find A1, and my reference would be taken from the bottom surface of the canopy, basically, not from the top section of the line. That reference of A1 being taken, now I will refer it to A1 to A2. Now when I look at these measurements here, I'm seeing a differential of 0. If I take it from the top of the loop of line, of the suspension line, and look again, I'm getting 90 millimeters. That 90 millimeters is not from the bottom surface, because this particular canopy has the flare on it. When I make a comparison with other canopies in a similar sort of category as Sabre 1 and Sabre 2, 135s, and I look at the differential between A1 and B1, I've got 65 millimeters, I've got 60 millimeters. And here, effectively, we've got 0 millimeters. The angle of incidence on this airfoil was not correct, which gave it a really shitty opening characteristic, and on high wing loadings, during an approach, they had a terrible reputation, and probably was the reason for the company to change its name. And it was really quite sad, but the benefit of hindsight, I would carry on jumping this canopy if I was jumping, but I would definitely make this line trim the appropriate length. You could achieve that by getting the trims correct, because when we run a reference from, again, the correct reference point, that's no good. A1 to B1 is bad. A1 to C1, 15, okay, 15 millimeters from my reference point, and on something like a Sabre I've got 180, 165, so 150, it's not terrible. Going to the D, I've got 35. Here I've got 39, and I've got 35. So the C and the D lines were not bad. The B line was okay, but the A line was way too long because they were using a wrong reference point. So this is just an excellent example of wherever you choose to make your measurements, run it the same throughout. And if you happen to have a canopy with a flare, be careful. So back on other things, stabilizers. Stabilizers should have some slack built into them. Generally, some canopies have no stabilizers. Evolution, the Flight Concepts as well, they have the reserve, has flares. Some of the high-performance canopies took the stabilizers off. They're a good place to put your slider stop. I would always take a little look-see before, so I'll take from the edge of the stabilizer again to that stitch. Here I'm saying 41 centimeters, 410, and so on. Occasionally you will find one where there is no free space there for the stabilizer, so you can imagine as this canopy opens, the force transfers into this little attachment point and then into the stabilizer. Some stabilizers are loaded, they have reinforcing in them, and they can cope with that, but this particular one wouldn't be good like this. And you'll see some reserve canopies that I found and some mains where it just gives me a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth seeing too much tension on there. And on the B lines, we're seeing it on some canopies where there's a lot of slack, and what I've had to do in some models is remove that stitch and just move it further down the line to help to avoid that the A line comes through. In this case it wouldn't because there's a slider stop on it, but on other ones you'll see the damage in the A attachment area for the tip, and all you have to do is move that stabilizer down the line a little bit more, being careful not to have it loaded up so much that you'll start damaging the canopy. Okay, but again, when you get your canopy back from a reline, or if you're doing it yourself, please put these two skins together, left and right, and check it out. Now, this is brand new from the factory. It was brand new, not been jumped since '92. And there you can see there was a little bit of a quality control issue in more places than just this. Coming on down to the next one. Those two look okay. What other questions do you have? So my line trim will be reference A1 to B1, A1 to C1, A1 to D1. So I'm getting the angle of incidence that the canopy has. And then I will take a reference D1 to D2, D1 to D3, D1 to D4, D1 to D5 on one side, and then to the C's, the D's, and the A's. So on my chart, I will have the angle of the canopy, and then across, I'm doing on one side because of course I check the symmetry between the left and right hand sides. I've got my reference here, and when I put the new line set on, typically I'll use a different color of course, I can see, whoa, this is radical. Here on this Sabre 2 with microline, when it came in, I didn't put how many jumps were on it, but when it came in, the difference between A1 and A5 was 128 millimeters. So the A5 was 128 millimeters shorter. Of course, the new line set goes on the canopy, and the difference between A1 and A5 is now plus 5 millimeters. So the tip A line, A5, is 5 millimeters longer than my reference point of A1. And so on through the canopy. Once you get to the D's, there's a little bit of a change in shape. All perfectly normal. If you can't measure it, you're not going to be able to improve it. So keep notes, and you'll stop giving a customer a canopy that has a brand new line set on, but the line set had the wrong label on the packet, for example. I've had that happen to me before. The difference between a Sapphire 1 and a Sapphire 2 is significant. But the label was incorrectly marked. Luckily, it didn't go into service because I had my notes and I could see this just does not compute. So you do further investigation instead of letting it get out there. I have had a canopy come in where they had tried all sorts of things and teaching this guy how to land. He just couldn't get a landing well on his canopy. It was a nice surface area. And when it eventually came to me for an inspection, whoever had put the lines on, bless them, they'd put the A line on the B line position and the B line was on the A line position. So no wonder the poor guy couldn't get a nice landing out of it. Luckily, it was in the 200 square foot range. So it wasn't deadly exactly, but suboptimal, shall we say. Once your stabilizers are on and properly stitched, preferably in a way that they will stay on for the life of the line set and not have an unscheduled rapid disassembly during an opening, I can see sometimes. I hope that's useful to you. Let's move on to the next subject. I'd like to try and answer a question that I got from the comment sections about the slider, getting the slider down. Quite often you'll hear people talking about the slider not coming all the way down to the top of the risers. It kind of hesitates maybe a meter or so up the lines. It's probably an indication that the canopy doesn't have a heavy load, which is great. After having a nice soft opening as well, another bonus. There were times when you'd go through no problem getting the slider down. In fact, it would come down too easily after a kaboom opening. Once you recovered from the initial dazed and confused situation, you'd look up, there'd be no slider. And then you'd felt this funny movement down in your underwear, and there it was, gone straight through. So having the slider not come down all the way is one of the lesser evils. How can you get it down? Well, I'd prefer to leave my brakes set and just try pulling on the back risers maybe. What you're trying to do is change the angle of the canopy by pulling the tail down. As you pull the tail down, your canopy is going to slow down and your inertia, your body is going to swing out in front a little. That's going to get more pressure into the intakes. The tips of the canopy through the crossboard vents will hopefully move out a little bit more. And if the outside lines move out a bit more, they'll help to force the slider down. Alternatively, if you lean back and press your risers together, being careful not to dislodge a toggle, but if you press your risers together, it has a similar effect potentially. Risers are going up to the slider grommets, even if they're 2 meters above you, and then the lines spread out towards the tips of the canopy. If you can get that angle changed a little by pushing the risers together, you might find the slider comes down. We see people, and that includes highly experienced tandem masters, flying around with the slider halfway up under toggle control. And when you interview them afterwards, they say, oh, I tried everything, it wouldn't come down. But actually, if you watch during the landing, as they're flaring, whoom, the slider comes down. So don't do any of this ringing the bell to try and get the slider down. If you are releasing the brakes to try and move it down, release your brakes, let the canopy fly full drive, and then do a simulation flare for landing. It's going to drop the tail down, you swing in front a little, and the canopy is going to be trying to fly away from you, which will get the cell pressure higher, pushing the tips apart, and with any luck getting the slider down. As far as your question on lubricating lines, I certainly lubricate lines, but I use PTFE spray, Teflon spray. Silicone spray I used to use, and then I found Teflon I just preferred it somehow. WD-40, it's not a lubricant. WD stands for water displacement. If you look it up, there are loads of videos explaining how it was developed to spray on the outside of spacecraft to stop the condensation gathering, and which of course with the cold fuels inside, it would turn to ice, and that develops all sorts of problems. So WD was water dispersant, and 40 was just the batch number, the chemical mix that really worked well for the job that it was intended for. Of course, the marketing department have jumped on it and recommend you use WD-40 to remove lipstick from your collar, clean the toilet, and lubricate anything that moves. Try PTFE spray. It's probably what's on the line in the beginning, a Teflon-based lubricant. I hope this answers it. Give it a try, and stay curious. Happy landings and sweet openings. Here's a little trick on how to repair a line. It's considered a temporary repair until your new line set arrives, but it really works great. I hope you enjoy it and find it useful. You've got some damage down here caused by the slider shimmying about. The protector the canopy came with is not much use, so of course I'm throwing that, and I'm going to be fitting one of these red tubular nylon covers once a repair is made. It acts as a sacrificial piece, and the damage will happen on that before it happens on the lines. Check out the link videos that have been previously uploaded. Here we go. The line next to the damaged one is still healthy. So the first job I do is use that as my reference point. So when the repair happens, I know the length is going to stay similar. Of course, I'm checking up at the canopy end, but to avoid having to have everything pulled out tightly all the time, I simply make a little reference mark across these two lines. Then that's going to be lining up when the repair is made. I come back, and from the link to the place where I'm going to be starting my repair, I'm choosing, just pulling a number out of the air, I'm choosing 45. Okay, so that's 45 is where I put a mark. Now that's where the repair is going to be entering. So this actual original line, I need to have a tail to finger trap. So I'll come back, and I'm choosing 10 centimeters from that mark further down, and I make an angled line which represents, that means I'm going to be cutting the line there. And we've got no twists, everything's looking good. I take my new piece of line that I'll be using for this repair, and I'll make a mark 10 as well. Let's find one with here we go. I'm just ignoring that mark and putting, I want this cut at a very nice easy angle, so I'll drop out some of these fibers, and that's going to give me a much more gentle change in the diameter. Okay. The same thing's going to happen here. So I'm cutting the damaged line now at a nice acute angle. Maybe drop a couple of the fibers out to get it an even more gradual transition, so that when the force is spiking through this, it doesn't all happen in just one area. If we can make this nice and gentle, it will cope better. Good. So my repair line, here's my mark. It goes around the connector link and back up. Finger trap tool goes in and it exits at that mark. I hope this is reasonably clear on the image. I like to keep both ends exposed, both tails exposed from the weave until the job is actually complete. So I'll exit, take my repair line, and in it goes. Now I can pull some tension on these two tail ends here to cinch the actual junction point nicely together. Then brush back using my fingernails, and you can see here, oops, I did not enter far enough away. So I'll come back, exit the same place that it was previously, capture those fibers and pull them through and try and do a better job. Okay. So I've pulled those tight, and this now, the damage line is eliminated, and I need to guesstimate where the actual loop is going to be on the link. I'll leave myself a little bit of space to play with the finger trap size of the loop size, because when I run a stitch across here, I'm going to also incur a bit of shrinkage. So let's just have a look here. From the link, I'm making the loops the same size approximately that exist on the original one as partner next door, and the section of finger trapping, I'm going to say we use about 13 centimeters. That gives me some space. Cut this at an acute angle as possible. I won't bother with the fancy stuff just yet. For now, I'm going to back off the tension on my riser. Really handy tool this. Get yourself one. Release the tension and form my loop for the link. Gently does it. Through it goes. Of course, each time you make a finger trap, the line is going to be shrinking just a wee bit, so you'll work out some way of compensating for that. That's a bit smaller. Let's push it back a bit. It's almost there. I need to adjust it, so I'm pushing the line back through. There we go, marks are there. Come back and clamp her down. Now with tension on that, I can pull, and I'm looking for my reference marks that I made at the 80 centimeter, and I can see here at the moment I've got about 6 millimeters, so I can play around here, slip a bit out and pull again. Now I've extended it by about 3 millimeters, and what I'm going to do is take it to about 6. So Okay, so the repair line and the original line on its partner next door, now I'm seeing it's actually about 7 millimeters difference. So I'll come back and give myself a new reference point for my entry and exit point of the finger trapping. Little bit darker line. I'll cut on. That's going to be exit point. And I'm still a bit further up here. Now we go off to the sewing machine, do some stitching here, and you'll see how much shrinkage we get from the stitching. So we're back from the sewing machine, and the zigzag stitch that I've made here, about the same distance over each side, and the stitch there have shrunk the line. And when I look with tension on these, I check out my match marks, and we're not too bad. The bottom end is zigzagged back and forth. This is just one long zigzag with no back stitch, because I don't want to increase the bulk in an area where the slide is going to be creaming past. What I prefer to do, as I'm not on a production line and I don't hear the guns firing, so they're not coming over the hill and the war's about to start, so I have time. I don't mind drinking cold coffee. So I'll pull the threads out both on one side of the job and load them up. Slip the end through inside the line, and this is going to stop it from unraveling. If you just leave it cut short, it might have a tendency to unravel quite enthusiastically. And again, you could avoid unraveling by back stitching, but in this particular area, I'm trying to keep things as smooth and flat as possible. So I prefer using this particular technique. I'm not tying a knot first, I'm just throwing both threads inside, snipping them off, and then back inside it goes. And that's how you can repair a damaged line. Of course, now there's no way I'm putting this stuff back on. I'm going to use a sacrificial protector that covers my connector link or soft link, a mill and repeat link, and it protects the line. So when the slider comes down and starts shimming around, it will put the damage onto my line stroke link cover and not onto my lines. Check out that video on how to do it. Links. There we go. Now you have time to get on that sunset load with Hugh Hefner's buddies. So it's time to put the kettle on, have a cup of tea, pat yourself on the back for making it this far. Congratulations. Again, you deserve medals. Anybody who's asleep, just wake them up and get them to hit the thumbs down button twice, because it obviously wasn't good enough for them. If you did find some value in this, please give it a thumbs up. Tell your friends, maybe they'll find it useful as well. Consider subscribing, because there's a chance I'm going to get around to making some other videos. Make comments below and I'll have a read of them. I don't always answer, sorry, I'm a bit slow with that stuff, but if there's something else, another subject that you'd like to be discussed, feel free to make a comment below. I wish you all the best. Many happy landings. Go well.